you really can't use beauty as an apologetic in favor of the Christian faith. Or can you? We're joined by Xandra Grieme, who will argue that you can, here on All Rise.
All right, well, all rise, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. It's me once again, Derek Caldwell, writer, content creator, beauty creator. We'll find out. And I'm joined once again by, don't comment yet. I'm joined, I don't want to hear what you're going to respond.
I won't say anything.
Yeah, okay.
Here's the beautiful, beautiful man. You just are.
You sound like my wife. Author and speaker, Abdu Murray. How's it going, Abdu?
It's going great, going great. Surrounded by beauty.
Yeah.
In this grand world, which points me to something.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to have Xandra on to talk to us about how beauty, in fact, does point us to something beyond the creation. You know, I hear this wonderful, I call it a crystalline phrase because the way it sounds. Peter Berger, it's not my phrase. Peter Berger came up with the phrase, signals of transcendence, and it just sounds like crystals clinking together. But there are signals of the transcendent in the temporal, in the finite. And I think I believe that 100%. I know beauty can be considered a subjective thing, that there's no possible way to garner objective truths from subjective experience, like the experience of beauty. But we're here to explore that issue because I think that that's not right. I think that we can find signals of transcendence in the created beauty. So with us, as part of here to talk about the Museum of Created Beauty is Xandra Grieme. Xandra is a good friend of ours. She's also a colleague and a top flight apologist, someone you should get to know. Go to museumofcreatedbeauty.org. But Xandra is has a bachelor of science from Colorado State University, university I've had the pleasure of being at, and apparently of recent vintages has the pleasure of having a viral football game on television that everyone and their brother, even people who don't watch football for some reason watch.
I thought you were going to say Outbreak. That was way better.
Yeah, viral football games is far better than viral outbreaks.
Yes.
But depending on who you ask, yeah. Yeah, exactly. But she's got her Bachelor of Science from Colorado State University and later studied at the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. She continued her studies at Victoria University of Wellington, where she completed a master's degree in conservation biology. And her scientific research includes work on parasitology, flow cytometry, and ecological restoration. Xandra is passionate, and you'll hear that, by the way. You'll hear plenty of that. Passionate about educating youth on our role as stewards of the natural world. She's currently serving as a curator for the Museum of Created Beauty, which we're here to talk about today. So, without further ado, welcome Xandra to the show. It is such a pleasure to have you, to see you, and to be able to do some ministry together here on the show on All Rise. So welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah, my pleasure. Our pleasure. Our pleasure.
Yeah.
So tell us, beauty as an apologetic. What do you think?
Well, first, can I say something real quick?
Wait, yeah, hold on.
They just launched, so this Museum of Created Beauty.
Yeah.
I've taken a little virtual stroll through it. And it really is like, it's super cool. It looks beautiful. When you join, when you get in, Ken Boa greets you. You go to these and you go to different rooms, and there's just these beautiful videos and music. You get to hear Xandra read about what you're watching, and she's always been, and this is a term of endearment, this weirdo who sees beauty and sees design in all of these crazy things and finds all these facts and I love animals, and she's telling me things I'd never even heard of or dreamt of. So she's perfect for this project. So I just advise everyone, go out there and check this out because it's really cool, and I've never seen anything like it before.
And so let's dive into it then. Obviously, the museum itself is one thing. I want to talk about that in a minute, but let's talk about the point. What's the point of this? If you're going to have a Museum of Created Beauty, is it just to say, oh, that's pretty, or is there more?
There is so much more. I think people are a bit skeptical about using beauty for, anything other than just the feels, making people feel good. But historically, beauty has been used in Christendom throughout the ages as a very powerful signpost that points to more. So while it's true that you read, writers like Roger Scruton, perhaps, who say unless someone enjoys the aesthetic experience, he can't be said to have it. So there is a sense of feeling. I really appreciate that Walt Whitman poem that talks about, I heard the learned astronomer. And have you guys read that poem? It's really beautiful. Yeah. So
I know me some Whitman. But you go ahead though. Yeah.
That's fine. So he basically describes this young man who goes into an auditorium and hears this learned astronomer describing the stars, and it's completely stuffy and lifeless. And at the end of the poem, this young man just walks out by himself under the sky and marvels at the stars. And so yes, there is a sense in which beauty is something that you have to feel to actually experience, but we get caught up in that and we forget the other side of it. That it's not just about feeling, it's about understanding. So while you have Aquinas over here saying beauty is that which pleases when seen, you've got von Balthasar saying that beauty is that which captivates the mind. And I think they're both right, because people don't just have an emotional or a visual attraction to beauty, they have an intellectual attraction to beauty. And that's why this museum is so important, is it is geared towards people who are curious, people who are intellectual, people who are scholarly, but also just the everyday person who likes looking at beautiful things. It's for everybody. And there are many cases. I mean, I could go down a whole rabbit trail of how beauty does woo not just the eyes or the emotions, but also the intellect. So Derek, you were right when you said nothing like this has ever been done before. We're definitely in the testing phase and the experimental phase. But I have seen beauty work wonders as a Christian apologetic, and I'm really curious to see where this project goes.
Well, speak to us if someone were to say, and I have some thoughts on this, but I'd love to hear yours, is, let me give you an example of what I mean. Beauty as a way to actually have an apologetic value for God's existence, maybe even the God of the Bible's existence. You might have a little bit of a skepticism there because, for example, a lot of Muslims will say the Quran is incomparably beautiful in its language and its rhyme, because most of it rhymes. And then someone could say, well, hold on, that doesn't prove that it's from God. It just proves that a guy wrote something, possibly a guy wrote something that's really beautiful. And you might say, it's beautiful. And I might say, not really. And now we have this back and forth, and it's like, who's right? There's no measurement of that. And of course, Lewis and others have made arguments for God's existence from the perception of beauty or the reality of beauty as well. So speak to us a little bit about that. I think that there's something important there for us to talk about in terms of, and I love that whole beauty is not just something that pleases the senses when seen, but it's also the thing that captivates the mind. So I'd love to hear you expound on that a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So beauty is deeply significant, and it's not just kind of, as you mentioned, Abdu, well, I think this is beautiful, but maybe he doesn't think it's beautiful, and it's, completely subjective. It's not like your favorite flavor of ice cream. We as human beings have the ability to recognize the beautiful that exists in the world. And that should make us ask questions about why it exists. Biologists have a really difficult time with this. It's interesting. I was reading a paper that was published rather recently in my field of conservation biology. And this group of authors kept using the same term throughout this paper. And the term was gratuitous beauty. And I found that really interesting. It was like they just could not explain, why it was there. It didn't really make sense. So if we're honest about the power of beauty, and if we're honest about our history, of the history of humanity, when we go back and we look at the development of science itself, the recognition of the universe as rational was crucial to that development. And it would not have developed if the universe was not rational. Einstein was deeply befuddled by this, about the intelligibility of the universe. Why is it that it's intelligible? Why is it that we can see it and measure it, and it has these qualia about it that we can attach onto as mere mortals, And so the elegance and the patterns yes, they're pleasing to the eye, but they're meaningful. They point to something more. And there's a Catholic scholar that I'm interested in right now called Ben Wiker, and he wrote a book called Meaningful World, where he writes about how, throughout history, from ancient geometers to modern chemists, everybody expected that things would be ordered in nature. But the reality of those discoveries always ended up being far more elegant, far more harmonious than any of them could imagine. And in that book, he says they suspected a melody and they discovered a symphony. And I really, so there is this bombardment almost as you're seeing the beauty in nature, as you're out there, you're doing the science, you're doing the observations, it's overwhelming. And it points to a supreme eternal presidency, as Augustine said. He called it this supreme eternal presidency of numbers, of similitude, of rhythm, of equality, order, all these things that we've learned to recognize in nature, or maybe even been designed to recognize in nature. And this leads the mind towards the realization that someone made all of this, that there is something going on. There's something, there are a lot of astronomers who, around the time of the development of the Standard Model and things, they were coming away from this, cosmologists saying, okay, this means something. The fact that the universe is not eternal, the fact that the universe had a distinctive start and that we can see that now tells us, I think it was Frederick Hoyle who said, there's a super intellect who has monkeyed with physics.
Yeah.
And he was bothered by the beauty. He was bothered by the organization, and it caused him to look deeper, and it caused him ultimately to search for and find God. And that's why beauty matters. That's why it's so much more than just a feeling.
Well, it's interesting too, because I know we're kind of getting to a little bit of the objective and subjective qualities there, but for different physicists and astronomers, it is fascinating now that one of the tests of truth that they have, so that people don't just think it's Christians sort of saying, oh, beauty means that there must be, one of the tests of truth that they have is that the equation is beautiful, that the results are beautiful, that they can put something together with something that within the equation, which looks like nothing to me, but to them, there's this symmetry and this simplicity, and that in and of itself points to the truth of the theory. Now, some scientists astronomers are pushing back on that now, but it is interesting because you don't want to lose that. There is something that they are grasping about beauty when they do that. You wish they would look into further, know, and some are, even, you mentioned Fred Hoyle, who ridiculed the Big Bang at first. That's why it's called the Big Bang, because he was making fun of this theory. And then towards the end of his life, he's moving closer and closer to something like theism, as he's forced to grapple with beauty and things like that. And I wonder, what have you found, Xandra, in sort of in that world? Are you seeing people coming to not even like getting past the discomfort, but saying, you know what, the beauty and symmetry that I am finding in nature, even today, is sort of moving me more towards the fact that someone did more than monkey with it, but he intricately designed it.
Oh, absolutely. On a general level, I could point to Thomas Dubay, and I don't know if that's who you were talking about just now. In his book, The Evidential Power of Beauty, he actually goes through and lists this whole long list of scientists who testify to the role of beauty in leading them to accept the right hypothesis as the best description of a certain set of data that they had. And beauty was the helper, the helpmate that pointed them towards this discovery, or towards the answer to their problem. I can talk about myself here a little bit. There was a time when I was not walking with the Lord. I was in my 20s. I was studying science. I was in biology. And I remember being up late one night, poring over this textbook, studying for an exam. And I was looking at these formations of diatoms. And diatoms, for those who don't know, is just single-celled algae.
Just a few of us don't know that, by the way. Most of us do know. No, I'm kidding.
Fair point. But these diatoms, I mean, you should Google this after we record this episode because they are so beautiful. And I was just poring over these structures, and I had this experience, and the experience I had was deeply reminiscent of times past when I had been in church worshiping to worship music. And it was like my spirit had stood up inside of me and started to worship God. And I was sitting in silence alone in my apartment studying for an exam. But the beauty of this was drawing me. And that's the thing about it. As C.S. Lewis describes beauty as basically having the power to sneak past the watchful dragons into a skeptical heart. So we all have these walls. But beauty is this powerful, gentle, sneaky, like thing that just kind of comes in before. We actually have a mutual friend, Meg, who she was telling me about this friend that she had in art school. So this isn't in the natural beauty side, but in the maybe a more aesthetic beauty. And she kept sharing the gospel with this friend of hers. And her friend was not interested in anything. But, you know, they continued as good friends. And one day, they're in college, they're working on still lifes. And at the center of a room is a bouquet of flowers. Very standard scenario for an art student, right? And they're painting this flower. And Meg looks over and her friend is drenched in tears. She's weeping silently to herself. And Meg goes over, taps her on the shoulder and says, "What's going on? Are you okay?" And she said 3 words: "God is real." God is real. And they talked about it later, and she explained that when she was beholding the beauty of these flowers, she knew there had to be more. The thing about beauty is it's not just something that we observe. It's something that happens to you. That's why when you're sitting in a hall listening to this live orchestra before you, and they play a particularly moving piece, you get goosebumps, right? Or when you stand under just this incredible fiery sunset, your heart quickens. So beauty moves us. Beauty happens to us, and it is a powerful force, not something that we can manipulate. And it points to the truth. I mean, in ancient thought, beauty, goodness, and truth were all linked, and they were all facets through which we can perceive reality. And so, Elaine Scarry, in her book on being just, she actually describes this very well, that the closer you get to beauty, the closer you get to truth, and the closer you get to goodness, because they're all interlinked. And the more you study beauty, it beautifies you. You become beautiful. Just like when you look for truth, you become more knowledgeable, which means in a sense you're taking on that truth. Or when you look towards goodness and are studying goodness, it puts this moral uprightness upon you. So it's transformative. It's a transformative, powerful force.
Yeah. I think about a phrase that I had thought about and tweeted sort of in response to some of the things that you just said. And a good friend of ours, Alonzo Paul, has talked about transmogrification, which is sort of an ugly word, sounding word to talk about a beautiful concept. But I think about it is that, we talk about this phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But I think about when you gaze upon that which God has created, and if you actually ponder the idea of a divine transcendent artist, beauty is not just in the eye of the beholder, but transcendent beauty beautifies the eye of the beholder. Because it's like you said, it's something that happens to you. So gazing on the one who beautifies you is a tremendous part of the experience. And as we're thinking too, I was thinking about Gavin Ortlund wrote a book called Why God Makes Sense of a World That Doesn't. And he has a section there on mathematics. And he says, what he describes is something you were describing earlier, Derek, and even you, Xandra, earlier, is the way in which beauty surprises somebody who doesn't expect to find it in the equations or in the discoveries. And it also points to maybe even they'll point out, look at the elegance of this proof, or look at the elegance of this balance of equations, or whatever it might be that they've come to sort of understand. And they'll talk about elegance, and they'll talk about beauty as not an emergent property, but as a property of the thing itself. And if someone were to say, you took a look at reality in general, or whether it's chemistry or physics or whatever it is, the abstract expression of those things or the understanding of those things is maths. And if math can be beautiful, and it is the fundamental way in which, at the basic level, we understand the orderliness of the universe, then essentially, in that sense, the code of the universe is beautiful. So in that sense, if the universe is objectively real, and math has beauty as an objective part of its reality, then beauty is an objective thing. So what I want to shift gears on and think about just for a moment because we could go on about the museum itself, and I'd like you to do that, by the way. I want you to talk about that and what we'll find in that resource. But I want you to speak as a scientist to our perception of beauty, and I have a sort of a thing I want to say here and think about whether it's right or wrong. And I realize that someone might say, oh, there's an explanation for that. But our perception of beauty, and someone might say that animals have perceptions of beauty in one sense because they're survival instincts. If there is a bird, a female bird of a certain type, and they see sort of physical features that would be considered beautiful, in air quotes, to that bird of a male of the species, and they mate with that bird as opposed to one that looks a little bit more pale, a little bit less virile, whatever it might be, that recognition of beauty serves an evolutionary purpose. But one, is it really a recognition of beauty in the same sense that we do? And two, does our perception of beauty serve an evolutionary purpose such that you could describe it or you could explain our perception of beauty and our desire to seek out beauty from purely evolutionary explanations? What do you think?
Well, I want to switch your questions around and answer the last one first, if I may.
Please. Yeah, please.
So if you push, in my experience, if you push any evolutionary biologists, if you corner them, they will not concede to the fact that beauty exists in and of itself. So there may be certain forms or patterns or orders that are biologically recognized to elicit a certain response, say in a member of the opposite sex of that bird you were describing or something like that. But they would be hard pressed to actually admit that beauty is a real thing. But even if you did, because it's a problem, right? Beauty is a serious problem for biology, naturalistic biologists. My question is always this. Okay, if you go back to the various instars of, let's say, a lantern bug. Okay, let me pause. An instar is a form that an organism takes as it's moving up to adulthood. So it hasn't reached its adult form yet. And so if you think of maybe a ladybug, they're born and they're like a little tiny black speck, and then they have another instar and they have, orange stripes on them. And then they have another instar and they're kind of this orange blob, and then they turn into a beautiful ladybug. So they've got a couple instars before the adult form. If you look at, say, a lantern fly, the instars leading up to that form are incredibly beautiful. Absolutely stunning. Those forms are incapable of mating. It's not for camouflage. There is no, it's gratuitous beauty, if I could quote that gentleman who wrote that paper I read recently. It's gratuitous beauty. There's no reason for it. It's absolutely over the top and serves no purpose. And we see this all over biology. And Darwin tried to explain this, many a time, and it was actually rather bothersome for him from time to time, the presence of this gratuitous beauty in nature. So yeah, I would kind of press against that. And then as to your first question, Wait, hold on now. I'm trying to remember. I had an answer.
I was trying. I can't even remember my own first question. I think so. The second question was, is there an evolutionary advantage or something where you could explain why beauty exists? But
because I remember my answer to your first question.
It was, do animals perceive beauty the way we do?
Right. Thank you. Do animals perceive beauty the way that we do? I would say no. I believe that animals might be able to perceive beauty. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in the cognition of various organisms, but I do know the more we learn about it, the more we're astonished at their ability of emotion and things like that. But I will say that human beings are amphibious creatures. And I mean that in a spiritual sense. Human beings are animal in one sense, right? We are physical. When we die, we will be eaten by worms and we will be dust. But in another sense, we are spiritual, and we can raise our head above the surface of the water and see this whole other realm, right? The spirit. And so I think that because of that, we can perceive beauty in the way that God perceives beauty, and animals cannot. And part of having this imago Dei, part of being created in the image of our God, is that we can perceive as he perceives. Not all things, right? I'm not saying we're omniscient or anything like that, but we take on what our dad takes on because we're his children. And as we're conformed to the mind of Christ and as we're conformed to his image, we start to look like him. We start to resemble our Father who has adopted us. And beauty very clearly matters to the Lord. I mean, his experience of the natural world is one of delight. We see that all over the Bible, especially in the Psalms. Psalm 104 says that he takes delight in all that he has made. So we as his children can take delight in that in a way that animals cannot. We hear God in Genesis. Every time he creates something, he steps back. Look at that. That is very good. And you probably know this, Abdu, but that word taub can be translated as very beautiful.
Right.
So it's actually saying this is so valuable and it's so beautiful. And so what matters to our Father should matter to us. And that's why I think humanity can see and perceive and interact with beauty and also create beauty, bring beauty into the world in a way that animals cannot.
All right. Well, if you love hearing content like this and thinking about apologetics in new, really exciting ways, then you're going to want to subscribe to the show. We're going to have people like Xandra on and others that are really on the cutting edge of where apologetics is going. And this is so helpful because there's so many tough questions out in the world. So if you want to help out, subscribe. You can click the bell is somewhere down here. And then you'll get notified when we have new content like this coming out, and share it with your friends and family. It really helps us get the word out. We appreciate it.
One of the things that springs to mind is that as you gaze at, it's one thing for you to gaze upon the figure of a member of the opposite sex and say that would be advantageous for the propagation of my genetic code. It's another thing altogether to look at a majestic mountain and think the same thing, because you know that is not habitable for you. You know that, or look at a desert and say, boy, that's gorgeous. What's gorgeous about it? It's lifeless and dead, but something's beautiful about it. So it doesn't seem to me that there is, in other words, to grant an evolutionary advantage to that recognition of that kind of beauty is simply ad hoc. You're just saying that, as opposed to, or looking at the stars and thinking, that's amazing, that's gorgeous, that's beautiful. What does that do to get you a mate? Nothing. So I think that there is some level to which that stuff just doesn't fly as well. So there is, it's not a perception of responses based on biology to look at, to me at least, to look at the sun and think that's amazing. Other than to be amazed by something that signals something greater than yourself. So, but yeah, anyway, this is just some, I could go on forever about this because I love this topic, but yeah, go ahead, Derek.
Well, I wanted to ask one that I think would be, I think a lot of people watching it, because everyone is a little skeptical of things and using beauty, like you mentioned, even Christians can be skeptical of this. And I want to kind of look at the skepticism there, because and this will be kind of a personal one for you, Xandra, but there was a Catholic scholar, also a scholar of Balthazar, named Edward T. Oakes, and he was talking about the despair in modern art, and he was really sort of consumed with the meaning of beauty. And he cited a gentleman and a native of Littleton, Colorado, which, as people know, is the site of the Columbine shooting.
And that's my hometown as well.
Yeah, and you went to Columbine, correct?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. And so this individual was, for obvious reasons, thinking about despair in the world and how it comes to be. And he discussed the transformation of the American landscape, because beauty in one sense is getting harder and harder to see. And we've all got screens in front of our faces now, which wasn't even an issue back when this guy wrote this. But I guess what I love about the Museum of Created Beauty is it has created a place for people to feel that embodied beauty. But I want to read what he wrote about what we're seeing in the world now and get your perspective on it, because this is kind of what we're facing when we're talking about beauty. And yet it seems to be it's getting choked everywhere. I was just in my hometown this weekend, and all the beauty of the fields and of the rows of corn that used to be there, which has its own sort of beauty, the natural world, is being sort of wiped out. And there's being, this isn't a capitalist critique or anything, but there's this huge Eli Lilly plant that's going here. There's this huge other plant that's going there, and all these plants are popping up everywhere. But this gentleman wrote this, and he was talking about how here the landscape has gone from Americana, this beautiful, almost Norman Rockwellian sort of vision, to the strip mall. And he said, growing up in an anonymous landscape, how can anyone escape his own encroaching sense of anonymity? In this world, meaning evaporates. In a world of monotonous getting and spending, and the need to shake things up to make a mark may overpower everything else, including sense. The trenchcoat mafia's particular brand of evil may have stemmed from a terrible absence, a loss of perspective that might be one of the unforeseen consequences of a loss of place. And I'm just curious because, there was also, and I'll say this one really quick, but Amy Brown Hughes was channeling Gregory of Nyssa, and she wrote that we are the beholders of the capital B beholders beholding of us. God's beholding activity is not a passive quality, but an intimate triune engagement with humanity. And I don't know, there's something about viewing those two together and how we've sort of lost the sense of the beholders beholding of us. And that's kind of what you're talking about earlier. That's what beauty is. It's the sublime. It's recognizing and feeling that thing inside that shows you there's something bigger. This is a long and rambling question, but I'm trying to kind of get to the point of there seems to be a loss of something. And so how would you argue to people now who they don't really see beauty that much, and they see so much sort of anti-beauty and destruction of beauty? You could especially even point to Columbine. What about the grotesque? It becomes kind of this problem of evil question. And how would you address that in a world that's sort of increasingly choked of beauty, I guess?
Yeah, that's an amazing quote that you read. I'm just still turning it around in my head. One thing that comes to mind is, I suppose earlier we touched on the connection between beauty and truth, but now it makes sense to pivot and connect beauty and goodness, because many thinkers have actually posited that we are morally obligated to pursue beauty because the connection is so powerful between goodness and beauty itself. Beauty makes us better. Beauty betters us as people, and beauty betters the world. And that's why Francis Schaeffer wrote that if Christ truly is the Lord of our whole lives, the Christian life should produce not only truth, not only goodness, but also beauty, because beauty brings us back to the other two. So I think it's really important for the Christian life to produce beauty. It not only because it's an avenue through which we perceive reality, but because it's an avenue through which we are perceived. We are beholden by the beholder, as you say. God, we expose ourselves to God. And it's terrifying to do that. And I wonder if that's why beauty sometimes makes people uncomfortable. This mockery, this belittling of beauty is something that is fascinating and also horrendous to me. But I think it's because when you stand stark and alone in the middle of the night on the top of a mountain and there's no one around you, and you look up and you look at the Milky Way blasting across the night sky in perfect, utter silence, it is terrifying. And you experience that you are a tiny speck of dust on a planet, which is also a tiny speck of dust, which is moving at an insane amount of speed through the universe to God knows where. And it's black and it's lonely and it's terrifying. And that makes you feel fear. And fear maybe is why people don't like beauty. But when you couple that with the idea that the one who spun these galaxies in the palm of his hand sees you, knows you, and loves you more than anyone else ever could, and that he is for you and he wants to pursue you and love you and he wants you to be his child, that fear very quickly translates into humility, into gratitude, into love. And those are wonderful things. And that's what beauty does for us. Yes, there's the awe and the wonder, but it is terrifying. But truly, when you experience beauty and beauty begins to transform you, what you get as a product is love. And that is not something to shirk away from. And as von Balthasar said, God pity the man who tries to separate beauty from her two sisters. And he was talking about truth and goodness there. Mm-hmm. He says, she will not go without taking them along with herself in an act of mysterious vengeance. And we can be sure that whoever sneers at her name soon will no longer be able to love.
Well, I think to me, that sounds like, for the Christians listening to this, cultivating, if I hear you right, cultivating beauty is a part of let your kingdom come.
Absolutely.
It is part of that role that we have as Christians to be salt and to preserve, but it's part of bringing in God's
this is
kingdom,
so
part
important.
Of that inbreaking.
This is so important because it steers away from mysticism. And I don't mean, I think mysticism in some forms is fine because there's mystery involved in these things and there's awe. But this actually gives you a practical guide for living alongside of it. And you would think that beauty, goodness, and truth, if they exist in this sort of triumvirate relationship, you'd expect to see a practical side of living in this way where you live out the kingdom in your life so that beauty isn't just something you see, smell, or taste, or touch. It's also something you experience by the virtue of actions. And you can perceive moral beauty in so many things: mathematical beauty, moral beauty, visual beauty, auditory beauty, olfactory beauty. These things surround us all over the place, and we're like saturated by it. Just fascinated by this. So let me shift a little more on the practical side from sort of this esoteric stuff that we're talking about, as wonderful as it is. I just want to make sure we talk about the Museum of Created Beauty. What do people experience when they enter? How do they access it, and what do they experience when they enter?
Yes. Oh man, I'm excited to talk about this. Shameless plug. Well, as you mentioned before, Abdu, they can go to the website, which is simply museumofcreatedbeauty.org. And it's free. We appreciate donations, but we're a museum. We're all about, the experience, and we want to bless people without doing damage to your pocketbook. And so you can create a membership for free, and then you're going to enter into the lobby, and you'll see Dr. Ken Boa standing there, and he'll welcome you to the museum and explain what it's all about. And from there, you can explore there are 3 cubes inside of the lobby, and each of those cubes is a world that you can enter into. So you basically change size depending on which cube you enter. The first one is called the macrocosm, which means anything that you need a telescope to see. So that's where you're going to go to fly over a swirling galaxy or explore through a cloudy nebula and learn about all these things that are way out there, and they're going to be right in front of your face. It's very fun. The second cube is the midicosm, and that's anything you can see with the lens of your eye. So, a tree, a beautiful butterfly, a forest, a river. And then the third and final cube that you go down is the microcosm. The microcosm is the world seen under a microscope. And it's here that you can explore snowflakes and twirl them around and see how they're made, pollen grains. It's just super fun. So we're having a lot of fun designing it, and a lot of fun with our 3D amazing virtual experts who are building all of this stuff for us, because that's way beyond my mind. I don't know how they do what they do. There's one artist on our team who worked on the leafy sea dragon room. Do either of you know what a leafy sea dragon is by chance?
I so wish I did.
A lot of people have never even heard of them. They are the most beautiful, graceful, incredible creatures. Imagine a seahorse, but kind of turned flat on its side, flying horizontally.
I think I've seen these before.
Not flying, but moving. And it's covered in leaves, and they're so cool. But this artist, in one of the experiences when you're swimming around in the leafy sea dragon room, you can shrink yourself down and zoom in to one of the eggs, the leafy sea dragon eggs, which the males carry them on their body. And you can look inside of it and see this sea dragon fry as it grows and all the different parts of the egg. I mean, it's just fascinating. It's really fun.
Wow.
So check it out.
So Xandra, how can they find more about you? Your apologetics bent is not just towards arguments for God's existence from beauty, but also science, given your background. You're versed in other areas of apologetics as well, from history to other things. So if someone's interested in having you speak or present in any way, how do they get a hold of you? How do we find out more about you and your ministry?
Yeah, they can always email me at the museum. Simply email Xandra, Xandra, at museumofcreatedbeauty.org, and I'll get your email and I will get back to you.
Excellent. Well, Xandra, it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you for making the time, for being a part of this, and for helping with the Museum of Created Beauty. You guys have given a gift to us in this endeavor. Absolutely. And I'm just grateful for your work, for your ministry, for your friendship, and for what God is doing to you and through you for the sake of his kingdom. So thanks again, Xandra, for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's wonderful to see you both.
You too. Well, friends, this is the closing argument. And I don't have much of an argument to make, except for the fact that each one of us recognizes there's something in us that recognizes beauty when we see it. It comes in its various forms. But I would challenge you, as you go back and you deliberate, think about why it is that you perceive beauty at all, why it is that you perceive beauty in nature, in other people. And is it a signal of something transcendent? I would encourage you to go to Museum of Created Beauty and see what's there yourself. But I would also encourage you just to walk outside. And yes, there's plenty of ugliness in the world, but that ugliness is measured by a beauty. So if you can say there's too much ugliness in this world to believe that there's a God who's behind all this, you're measuring that ugliness as the derogation, as the parasite on the beautiful. And if that beautiful is there in an objective sense, by which you can judge the world as objectively ugly in some places, maybe there's an objective beauty that speaks to your heart and speaks to your mind. And so I would challenge you, find the evidence for where that beauty actually comes from. Seek out people like Xandra, Museum of Created Beauty. Maybe you'll see something you didn't see before. Maybe it'll surprise you. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, the defense rests.